Hare Krishna, dear devotees, please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. I would like to warmly welcome you to the celebration of the third annual Books Are the Basis Week Festival. This festival is solely dedicated to encouraging devotees in the daily reading of Srila Prabhupada's books. Today, we offer you a presentation by Her Grace Urmila Devi on the Nectar of Devotion. I hope you will relish this glorification. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel as we will be releasing new content every day of the festival and regularly thereafter. Thank you. All glories to Srila Prabhupada's transcendental books.
Jaya Radha Madhava Punya Vihari.
Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti-Vedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Sarasvati Deve Gauravani Pacharni Nivase Sisanyavadi Paskatyade Satarni Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatham Bikam Sam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sadvadutam Parijana Sahita Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha Panchakalpajubhascha Kipasindhavyabacha Patitanam Pavanevyo Vaishnave Namo Namaha. So in studying Srila Prabhupada's books, teaching Srila Prabhupada's books, just reading Srila Prabhupada's books, or distributing Srila Prabhupada's books, one of the most important and amazing and interesting and incredible is his book, Nectar of Devotion. So we're going to be looking today at, well, what is the Nectar Devotion and what makes it so amazingly incredible. We know that Srila Prabhupada produced this Nectar Devotion very early in the movement. And he wanted all the devotees to read it. He wanted all the devotees to read it in depth, to study it, and also to distribute it. But when we go through Nectar Devotion, which we'll be doing shortly, we'll go through an overview of what is in the Nectar Devotion, we will probably be astonished at the degree of depth into very intimate and esoteric subjects of Krishna Bhakti. So the most astonishing thing to me about the Nectar of Devotion, even more so than Krishna book, is that Srila Prabhupada was making this very high level of philosophy and lila available to his disciples and to the general public, practically speaking, from the beginning of his movement. And that's really amazing. I mean, when we think about the fact that Srila Prabhupada often would caution about delving into very high subjects prematurely. I mean, it was something that he repeated a lot because Srila Prabhupada had seen personally in India and, of course, heard from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur that those who delved into such topics prematurely ended up causing a disturbance. You know, jumping into things, as we say now, going above your pay grade. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread, those sort of sayings in the Western world. And jumping into something that you're not ready for can cause a huge disturbance. At the same time, Srila Prabhupada was not only making that available, but very much desiring that we do dive into it. So how is that? And again, it's not just for devotees. Let's look at it in terms of the devotees. Then we'll look at that in terms of the public. Then we'll look at how Mahaprabhu was teaching these things to Rupa and Sanatan, how Rupa Goswami took these teachings from Mahaprabhu and greatly expanded it, all based on Shastra. And then, as I said, we're going to look at the structure of the Nectar Devotion itself, just very briefly. So for the devotees, So the Nectar of Devotion, which is, of course, a summary study of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu of Srila Rupa Goswami, it gives a step-by-step guide and an overview guide of how to engage in bhakti yoga. How do you be a devotee? What do you do? I mean, there's instructions like that all over the place in the Bhagavad Gita and in the Bhagavatam and the Chaitanya Charitamrita. But in the Nectar Devotion, it's done very systematically. This is what you do, and this is what you don't do, and this is how you do it. So to know what to do, I mean, that's pretty important. If we want to know, am I situated properly in bhakti? Where do we turn? Nectar Devotion. If we want to know what is bhakti as compared to what is not bhakti, like what is karma yoga, what is gyan yoga, what is dhyan yoga, what is just ordinary karma, or what is vikarma, we can look in the Nectar Devotion instantly and very clearly and very explicitly. This is what bhakti is, and this is what bhakti is not. And again, it's very detailed. You stand up when you see the deities, take the Charanamrita. So we can know exactly what to do. You know, what do I do to advance? Open up the Nectar Devotion. It's right there. And it's not only what to do from the beginning, it's what to do all the way to the perfection, and what one does when one has achieved perfection, everything. It's a guide from beginner to perfect for all parts of the process. Then the Nectar Devotion also, actually the majority of it, is what does perfection look like? What is the goal? You know, we can read about, again, in a general way, Krishna talks about in the Bhagavad Gita, the stage of perfection in chapter 16, verses 20, I think 20 to 23, where he talks about samadhi, where you're always established in the truth. You think there is no greater gain. You're never shaken, even in the midst of the greatest difficulty. But that's pretty vague, right? And Krishna talks about that always think of me, become my devotee. Again, that's pretty vague. Of course, if we go to the Bhagavatam, we get a lot more information about all the different relationships with Krishna. But again, it's not giving us the real detail of the goal as to what is it that we will experience in the perfectional stage of bhakti. And the Nectar Devotion goes through that. It goes through the process, and what does perfection look like? What are the different components of perfection? What are the different categories of perfection? So we're very clear there. The Sambandha, the Abhideya, and the Prayojana are all crystal clear in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and the Nectar of Devotion. So this is very much why it's an essential book for the devotees to read. Now, what about for the public? And I personally find it astonishing that Srila Prabhupada wanted books like the Nectar Devotion and Krishna book distributed to the public. I mean, when I joined the Hare Krishna movement in 1973, one of the first things that I did was go out on book distribution in the O'Hare Airport in Chicago. So when I say one of the first things, I mean that very literally. So I had stayed in the temple previously, but when I moved in to become a permanent member of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the first day was on the day of installing the deities of Kishore Kishori in Chicago. The next day, we all went out on Harinam Sankirtan. And the next day, so 2 days after I moved in, I was at the airport distributing books. And if you can think about how little, I mean, I still know very little. I'm still at the very beginning. But if you can think about how little I knew at that point about Krishna consciousness, I mean, I'd read Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita as it is. I had read Krishna book, but I'd only been really practicing sadhana bhakti for a very short time. And there I was distributing Krishna book and Nectar of Devotion to the general public. And these are people who are quite obviously not following the 4 regulative principles. I mean, they're having illicit sex, they're taking intoxication, they're eating meat, they're gambling. Their lives were often not at all pious in any way. Many of them were not showing any interest in God at all. I mean, it's like nothing. And still, we were giving them this book on this is what you do. You stand up for the Rath Yatra card and you take the Charanamrita and you put on tilak. And then what you speak of the later parts, what is Vibhava and Sattvika Bhava and Sthai Bhava and what are the different categories of primary and secondary Sthai Bhavas and what's improper mixing of rasas. And we were giving this to, what we would say in America, Joe Schmo, any just a person, some random person, I guess anyone who had enough money to buy an airplane ticket or who had a relative who could buy an airplane ticket and they were taking them to the airport. And it wasn't even just at the airports. I mean, we were going out in parking lots and on the sidewalks of the cities and really just giving this book to anyone. So why would Srila Prabhupada do that? Why would Srila Prabhupada take such an advanced and definitely very esoteric book, such as Nectar of Devotion, Krishna book, and have us give them to literally everybody and anybody? And my conclusion on that comes from a statement Prabhupada makes in the Bhagavatam, where there's a description of the spiritual world. And Srila Prabhupada says that one should be captivated by this information. And this understanding of mine as to Srila Prabhupada's motives, not that I can know Srila Prabhupada's motives, but my understanding is very much related to Rupa Goswami's description in the Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu of what is the qualification for taking up pure devotional service. And he says the qualification is you have some taste, you have some interest, you have some attraction. He also says one should not be too attached or too detached, but that one has some attraction. Ravinda Prabhu told the story of how Tamal Krishna Maharaj and Vishnu Janand Swami were going traveling and selling Prabhupada's books and doing kirtan. So they would set up at a university or in a park, a city park, and they would have a kirtan. And if you're familiar with Vishnu Janand Maharaj, they'd be very melodious kirtans, with tambura and maybe even a sitar and harmonium and so forth. And so they'd be on a madras on the ground. And so they'd have this very beautiful melodious kirtan. And then they would distribute prasadam and very first-class prasadam. And then they would walk around the people sitting at the park or whatever, the campus, and would say, did you like the music? Did you like the food? And if they said, yeah, it was all right, then they'd move on. And if the person said, yeah, it's really special, then they would stop and talk to them and engage them more in Krishna consciousness. So it's like that. You pick up Nectar of Devotion and you're reading right away about how it relieves you of all material distress and gives you all auspiciousness. And Sandra Ananda gives you incalculable happiness. And people are going to say, wow, I'd like that. I'd like to, because these are the motives, right, for people taking up Krishna consciousness, as Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita. You want material happiness, or you want freedom from material distress, or you're curious, or you're already Brahman realized and you want to go further. So we don't have that many, Brahman realized people walking around. But of the first 3 categories, there's quite a lot. People are curious. Or people are like, yeah, I'd like to be happy. Or man, I'd like to stop being distressed. And that's right there in the beginning. One of the most powerful, in my opinion, pieces of writings that Srila Prabhupada produced is the preface to the Nectar of Devotion. It's something that I've read. I've read the Nectar of Devotion itself many times, but I've read the preface far, far more. I don't know, 50, 60 times I've read the preface, and I could read it thousands of times. And that's not actually part of the Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu itself. The Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu summary study starts with the introduction to Nectar of Devotion. But in the preface, Srila Prabhupada writes about rasa in a general sense, that rasa is the taste, the enjoyment that drives us on in whatever we're doing. And that it behooves us then to recognize that every single thing we do is a search for pleasure. Everything. Even the things we do that we wish we could stop doing, even our bad habits, whatever that may be. If it's a little bad habit like just sulking or, procrastinating, or if it's a big bad habit like breaking one of the regs or whatever bad habits a person is, or criticizing devotees, we're always trying to get some rasa out of everything that we do. The so-called positive things that we do, and even the so-called negative things that we do. And once we understand that I'm really looking for rasa, then we can say, well, where would I find the most satisfying rasa? And this is just such a profound thing to say. And Prabhupada also talks about how love is inherent. It's one of the differences between something that's living and not living. My phone here, it's not living, and I guarantee my phone does not love me. It really doesn't care about me at all. It has no emotions. If I turn it on, okay, I'm going to turn on my phone. It doesn't say, wow, thank you for using me. And it doesn't. Whereas somebody who cares about me might say, oh, Urmila, thank you for calling me, or thank you for coming over, or thank you for seeing me. But my phone doesn't feel like that. My phone doesn't, if I leave it in my room and take a walk, it doesn't say, why did you leave me in your room? I'm feeling separation from you. This love is the symptom of life. And it's fascinating. Prabhupada talks about how even a tiger has some love. We see this in the tiger's affection for its mate, and especially the mother tiger's affection for the cubs. But we see this even in plants. I mean, there's a book I finished not that long ago called The Secret Life of Trees, and how trees communicate with each other underground. And for example, if you come and cut down a tree and there's just a stump, the other trees will feed that stump underground, even though that stump has no leaves to maintain it. And so after some time, the stump may be able to shoot up a new branch with leaves on it because the other trees have been taking care of it. So this love exists, this propensity to love exists even in lower forms of life. What to speak of in the higher forms of life. And Prabhupada says, but we don't know where to repose our love. We don't know who to love. We don't know how to love. We're trying to love. Really, everything we're doing can be understood as trying to enjoy some kind of rasa, and everything we're doing can be understood as an attempt to love and be loved. And why are both of those things true? Because rasa can only be experienced when there is love. And this is so beautifully explained in the southern, western, and northern oceans of the Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu. That actual pleasure, it does not come just from having the senses meet their sense objects, seeing a beautiful sunrise or tasting some delicious pizza or smelling gardenia. That's not really the source of rasa. The source of rasa is loving and being loved. And the only way we experience satisfying rasa is to love the perfect person who is Krishna, and to feel that we are loved by that perfect person, which is Krishna. So right there in the preface, Srila Prabhupada's giving something that every Joe Schmo, that every person, every single living being who has at least human intelligence. I mean, this is obvious even in an animal, like someone's dog or cat, but they can't comprehend it. You can't go to your cat and talk about rasa. But anyone who has at least human intelligence can read the preface and say, wow, that's right. That's actually right. That's the essence of everything. And how attractive is that? Religion in the world has kind of a bad reputation for being about some angry, jealous God, who's very unreasonable, a very unreasonable, angry, jealous God. I mean, the descriptions of God in most of the world religions are almost like an abusive parent, that if you don't do everything that I say perfectly all the time, I'm going to make you suffer torture for all of eternity. Now, you'd be arrested, your kids would be taken away if you did that. So that's most people's view of God. Or they'll just say, general, God is love. But Srila Prabhupada is giving us, as I say, right there in the preface, which is his work. That's not part of the summary study. What does it mean to know God and to love God? And how does that come to the essence of everything we want? And then a person will read that and go, yes, I want that. It's like the preface is like an advertisement. Nowadays they make trailers for books and movies, and right. If you want to read this book or watch this movie, here's a little glimpse. So the preface is like that. It's like a little trailer for the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, for the Nectar of Devotion. Here is how you're going to find everything you want, the essence of everything you want. And so why not give that to everyone, even though it's for sure that the average person will not understand intellectually a lot of the Nectar of Devotion. I mean, that's for sure. A lot of things will just like, they won't really get it. But still it will be attractive. And they'll say, I want to get this. I want to understand it. I want to take a look at some quotes from Srila Prabhupada about reading the Nectar of Devotion. All right, so I'm going to read through some of these. Cultivation means practice, and the great acharyas have given a routine we can cultivate. For instance, the Nectar of Devotion by Srila Rupa Goswami deals with the cultivation of devotional service. And this book, which we have translated, has been very well received in European and American universities. So this I take as significant, that Prabhupada wanted the Nectar Devotion to be used in universities. Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Nectar Devotion is the actual science of bhakti. Bhakti is not sentiment. It is a great science, and we have to learn it scientifically. It is not that we have to wait for another life to cultivate devotional service. We can read the Nectar Devotion, live with devotees, rise early in the morning to attend Mangalarti, study Vedic literature, take prasad, and preach Krishna consciousness. So this is in the teachings of Lord Kapila for verses 25 to 26, which means it was given in a lecture. So here we have a lecture on Nectar Devotion given in 1970. So we have published our Nectar Devotion. So every one of you should read this Nectar Devotion repeatedly. The whole substance of Vaishnava philosophy and activities, everything is there. So every one of you read this Nectar Devotion once, twice, thrice. And here's one from another lecture, Nectar Devotion, 1970, Los Angeles. So these things, one after another, everything is clearly explained in this Nectar of Devotion. So each chapter you should read very carefully. And if you cannot understand, read it repeatedly. Don't all of a sudden, reading 1 or 2 page, immediately question, Prabhupada, what is this? What is this? What is this? Go on reading and the answers will automatically come. So this valuable book is now published. You should take full advantage. So the next is from an initiation lecture in 71. You will read all these things in our book, The Nectar Devotion, and Bhagavad Gita. Also, you should read all these books. The next one is from 1972. Srila Prabhupada says, you read regularly Nectar Devotion, regularly. All these books should be regularly read. That will give you guidance. You haven't got to ask repeatedly to me. Everything is there. You are selling Nectar Devotion? Devotee. We're waiting for our next shipment from Japan. Then we'll begin. Prabhupada. These 4 books will give you all guidance. Krishna, Nectar Devotion, Bhagavad Gita as it is. And what is that? Upendra. Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Prabhupada. All guidance. This is from a lecture of Nectar Devotion, 1972. My Guru Maharaj, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, he used to advise to read Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu everyone after initiation. At least he advised me. So this Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is very important as study book for the Vaishnavas. It is the science of devotional service. And people are, in Western countries, taking interest. In the Temple University, it has become a textbook in the religion class. There are 60 students who are regularly studying the Bhakti Nectar Devotion published by us, and gradually it is being introduced in other colleges and schools. So another lecture, Nectar Devotion, 1972. So this is the process. Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which we have translated into English, Nectar Devotion, is a very important book. It is the science of devotional service. If you want to be engaged in devotional service, then you must read the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and then we shall be able to see God. Wow, what a statement. We shall be able to see God. And we think about how Srila Prabhupada really wanted this book used in university studies, that people could see that Bhakti Yoga isn't just some sentimental thing or some, what do the sociologists call us, a new religious movement, or some kind of cult, but it was based on a very thorough and intricate science. I mean, when you go deeply into Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, it's really amazing. So where does this come from? Where does Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and Nectar Devotion come from? Well, it comes from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu teaching Rupa and Sanatan. Now, what fascinates me, and I've never found anybody who can explain this, is that most of what we find in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is in Mahaprabhu's instructions to Sanatana Goswami rather than in Mahaprabhu's instructions to Rupa Goswami. So that's something I've never quite been able to figure out. But of course, the Lord also does instruct Rupa Goswami for 10 days in Prayag. We find a lot of the topics of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu throughout the Chaitanya Charitamrita in discussions. We were just observing Hera Panchami, which is where the goddess of fortune servants arrest the servants of Lord Jagannath. And there, Swarup Damodar is speaking some of the topics from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and some of the topics from Ujjwala Nilamani. So these books of Rupa Goswami, the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and a companion book, Ujjwala Nilamani, one finds at various places throughout the Chaitanya Charitamrita, not even when Mahaprabhu is instructing either Sanatan or Rupa, but if he's just having discussions like with Ramananda Roya or with Swarup Damodar. But on the whole, Rupa Goswami got these instructions from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And then having received these instructions from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he greatly referenced the Vedic literature on theater. So what are the aesthetics of theater? And how does one experience rasa or taste or enjoyment in theater? And he then applied those with some adaptations to Bhakti Yoga. So what does this mean for us? It means that the Nectar of Devotion, the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, is coming from God himself, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, explaining what is the science of loving God. Wow. And explaining it to one of his most intimate associates in a very detailed way. I mean, this is, of course, what we get in a general way in the Bhagavad Gita. But in the Nectar Devotion, we're getting it on a much higher level. It's like these are people who already decided Sarvadharma and Parityajya Mamekam Saranam. They've already decided they want to surrender to Krishna, or Manmana Bhava Bhakti Majati Mam Namaskaru. They've already decided they want to always think of Krishna, become his devotee, and all right, well, now how do you do that? So we say that Mahaprabhu exemplified that coming as a devotee, that Krishna was saying, be my devotee. All right, well, how do I be your devotee? We can look at the devotees, and then he comes himself and says, here, I'll show you how to be my devotee. And so Mahaprabhu was like that, showing us how to be his devotee, but also giving us this guidance. Here's how you start off being a devotee. Here's how you're a devotee on a spontaneous platform. Here's how you really develop all the different components of rasa. And then he's asking his devotee, Rupa Goswami, to put this into a book and codify it. And then Srila Prabhupada is taking this and delivering it to us in a summary form. Now, Rupa takes it a step further than that. He doesn't just take what Mahaprabhu's taught him, and he doesn't just take from Bharat Muni and other Vedic scholars on rasa and theater. But you find that throughout the Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu, and you see this also in the Nectar of Devotion, Rupa Goswami is citing Shastra to back up every single thing that he says, every single thing. There is not one point that Rupa Goswami makes without a pramana. Nothing. And this point is very significant. I mean, I have to say, frankly, I've heard devotees classes or read devotees writings where they just make statements as if they're statements of fact. Well, it's like this, or everyone knows this, or it's an obvious fact. And they don't give any citation. They don't give any pramana. So, I'm an academic, and in the academic world, that's not allowed. You can't just say, you can't just throw out something. You can't just talk about numbers that you pull from the air as statistics, or you have to give some kind of reference. In the academic world, it's all going to be an empiric reference from some kind of research. And in the devotional world, we can have empiric references also, but we quote Shastra. Shastra is our highest pramana. And that's what Rupa Goswami does. And he does it throughout his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. And you see, Srila Prabhupada doesn't use all of Rupa's examples. He uses most of them. And Prabhupada does the same thing. He's saying, here's Rupa's example. Here's where it's from. It's from this verse in the Bhagavatam, or from this Purana, or from this Upanishad, and or from this authority. And such a standard is very important. So it's not only the what of nectar devotion that gives us this example and this template, but it's the how that gives us a template of how to present Krishna consciousness. That we know that when we're presenting Krishna consciousness, or when we're trying to understand what is Krishna consciousness, everything should be with reference to Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. Something shouldn't be out of our own concoction. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have our own realizations. We're persons, and we should have our own realizations. Now, everything that we teach should be also, part of us should be there. We're personless. At the same time, everything should be solidly based on Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. If Rupa Goswami does that, then there's no question that we don't do that. He doesn't need to do that. He's one of the intimate associates of the Lord. He's been instructed by the Lord. He could just say, well, Lord Chaitanya told me this. That's it. Or he could just say, I realized all this in samadhi. But that's not what he says. He's very solid. And I see a tendency among our devotees to kind of swerve from this. Just recently, I saw this, two people who had written books, and they asked me to review their books, and it was statement after statement after statement of supposed fact without any kind of citation. So studying the Nectar Devotion also gives us a template as to what is good preaching and what is good teaching. Now, not only does everything have citations, but wow, is Rupa Goswami systematic. He's systematic to the nth degree. It might even be a little overwhelming for some people, all of his categories and subcategories and sub-subcategories, but it's all very organized. I know devotees that go through Nectar Devotion and they're able to make different charts and graphs showing what is the relationship of everything. Now, that might not be obvious at a first reading of Nectar Devotion, but as one goes deeper, that becomes more obvious. So let's take a look now at the structure. This is just a very, very brief run through of the structure of the Nectar Devotion, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Okay, so the Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu, Bhakti means devotion, or Prabhupada would translate it as devotional service. Rasa Srila Prabhupada translates as mellow, and he says in the Nectar of Devotion himself that he doesn't have a good English word for the word rasa, and therefore he's using the word mellow. No, I don't know. He said he's using that because Srila Bhakti-Siddhanta used that word. I don't know what the meaning was in Bhakti-Siddhanta's time. In 2022, mellow is an adjective, not a noun, and therefore really wouldn't work at all. Rasa could be better translated perhaps as relationship, but it's a very hard word, as Prabhupada writes, to translate. It really means like the taste or the essence of things. Then Amrita means nectar, Amrita, not dead, always alive. Nectar in Sindhu is an ocean. So the basic overview is there's an Eastern Ocean, a Southern Ocean, a Western Ocean, and a Northern Ocean. So in the Eastern Ocean, there's varieties of bhakti. In the Southern, the ingredients of rasa. In the Western, the primary rasas, and in the Northern, the secondary rasas. So we're going to look at each of these oceans, very just touching what they're about. So on the Eastern side, which is what devotees study currently in ISKCON in the Bhakti-Shastrы course. So in the intro in chapter 1, there's an overview of devotion, then devotional service and practice, sadhana bhakti in chapters 2 to 16, in ecstasy, chapters 17 to 18, and in pure love of God in chapter 19. So these correspond to the 4 waves. Rupa Goswami divides his book into 4 oceans, and then each ocean is divided into different waves. So these chapters are corresponding to Rupa Goswami's waves. So this is another way of looking at it. Samanya Bhakti, Sadhana Bhakti, Bhava Bhakti, and Prema Bhakti. And Srila Prabhupada himself in the introduction gives this overview, a general description of devotional service, regulative principles, devotional service and ecstasy, and ultimate goal, love of God. So let's go through here with the Eastern Ocean. So in the preface, Srila Prabhupada explains, as we talked about already, love of God is the primary need of all beings. He also goes over the history of the book, its connection to Lord Chaitanya. The purpose of the book, to educate and elevate everyone to the position of a pure devotee. He talks about bhakti rasa, how it's the spiritual pleasure of devotional service, which one can taste by being trained in the science of devotional service. And he talks about rasa, which is the juice or pleasure in any activity, and how material rasa is unsatisfying and temporary. Now, in the introduction is when we actually begin the summary study. And here's the Mangalacharana. Actually, Rupa Goswami has a Mangalacharana for each ocean, briefly describing the book's content, and then the definition of pure devotional service. So one of the most important verses to know, Anyabilasita sunyam gyanakama anavatam anukulina krishnanushilanam bhaktir uttama. Yes? Or sarvapadi vinirmutantar paratena nirmala rishikesha rishikena sevanam bhaktir uchite. So this is something, I mean, anyone who says, I'm following Mahaprabhu, I'm following Srila Prabhupada, I'm engaging in bhakti yoga, should really thoroughly understand those verses, which are explained in this introduction to the Nectar of Devotion. And that's the what is bhakti yoga? What is pure devotional service? And it's right there in those verses. Yes? Then chapter 1 of the 6 characteristics of pure devotional service. And we talked about this before, relieving one of all miseries, kleshagni, giving extraordinary bliss, sandra ananda, being all auspicious for everyone, and so forth. And then also something that comes up over and over again in the Nectar Devotion, that devotional service surpasses liberation. It's so wonderful that it's above even liberation. Then chapter 2 are the principles of sadhana bhakti. So that there's sadhana, bhava, and prema, and each one of them is described, and the eligibility. Now, we talked about this already, that the eligibility for sadhana bhakti is attraction to pleasing Krishna. And the most important part is to always remember Krishna and never forget him. And that's, again, what an essential thing to understand. that practice of bhakti doesn't mean what I'm doing with my body so much. It means that why am I chanting 16 rounds? Why am I waking up early? Why am I reading the scripture? Why am I offering my food? To always remember Krishna. Okay, chapter 3, eligibility, attraction, again. And this is by the mercy of a devotee. And then Rupa Goswami is talking a lot now about Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti, which is impelled by faith in the scriptures. And so one's qualification for taking up Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti, in addition to being attracted to Krishna and not being too attached or too detached, is how much faith and knowledge you have in the scripture. Because if you're practicing bhakti based on your faith in the scripture, how much faith you have in the scripture is going to determine how qualified you are to practice Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. Then chapter 4, really a depth of being free from bhukti and mukti, being free from liberation and sense gratification. How the devotees in Vrindavan even reject the idea of liberation into Vaikuntha. Then chapter 5, that bhakti doesn't depend on anything else as bhakti. It doesn't depend on previous birth, purification through Vedic rituals, following varnashram dharma. It's not dependent on any of those. And I have to say, we find people in our Hare Krishna movement who think it does. They think, you got to have your varnashram right, or you can't do bhakti. That's not the opinion of Rupa Goswami. Why? Because bhakti is the constitutional position of the living entity. And there are people who argue with that. There are people who say, no, bhakti isn't our constitutional position. But Rupa Goswami is very clear. Bhakti is our constitutional position. Being eligible for bhakti and the process of bhakti are independent of anything else. Okay, chapter 6. Now, chapter 6, we get into this list of the 64 angas of bhakti. These are the 64 angas of bhakti, and particularly these are the 64 angas of Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. And then Rupa Goswami is giving evidence for these. So chapter 7, he takes the first 18 items, the 10 do's and the 8 do nots, and he explains each of them and gives evidence. In chapter 8, it's all about the 19th one, all about the offenses to avoid, that's a scary chapter to read. all the things you can't do. Don't offer obeisances on one hand, don't go into the temple in a palanquin. I haven't tried to do that one, but all these offenses to avoid. Chapter 9 is scriptural evidence for items 20 to 42. Chapter 10, scriptural evidence for items 43 through 46. Chapter 11, scriptural evidence for items 47 to 53. Chapter 12 for items 54 through 64, with emphasis on the 5 most potent items, which are then discussed again in chapter 13. And those 5 most potent items are reading the scripture, especially Srimad Bhagavatam, living in a holy place, especially the Vrindavan Mathura area, associating with devotees, chanting the holy name and worshiping the deity, that these items are so potent that they can bring out ecstasy even in a neophyte. And then a very important chapter is 14, and it's very important for the devotees to understand. This is where Rupa Goswami says, hey, these things might look like bhakti, but they're not. They might look like bhakti, but they're not. And again, he talks about things like varnashram, and he talks about gyan and vairagya. Wow, actually just one devotee I know who recently took up renunciation says, I'm really hoping to increase my gyan and vairagya. And I thought, oops. You need to read chapter 14 of the Nectar of Devotion. And so Gyan and Vairagya come from bhakti, but Gyan and Vairagya, knowledge and renunciation, are not qualifications for bhakti, because neither of them involve always remembering Krishna and never forgetting him. And in fact, they can be impediments for bhakti because they can make the heart hard. And therefore, one is advised not to practice Gyan and Vairagya, but to practice Yukta Vairagya, where we use everything in Krishna's service. All right, now chapter 17 and 18 is the definition of, oh, I must have skipped something. I don't have 15 and 16 here. Sorry. So 15 and 16 are on Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti. And chapter 15 is mostly on Ragatmaka Bhakti. What is the mood of these devotees in Vrindavan who are on the spontaneous platform? And then chapter 16 is about how to perform Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti. So once one's particular proclivity for Krishna has awakened, the way one performs Raganuga Sadhana is one meditates on a devotee, a Ragatmaka devotee who has a similar mood, and one takes up specifically items from the list of 64 angas that are favorable for one's particular mood, while still appearing externally as if one is in Vaidhi sadhana. All right, so chapters 17 and 18 are about perfection. And here's about Bhava Bhakti. So in chapter 17, how do you get to Bhava Bhakti? And this is either by sadhana or by mercy. And chapter 18 are the symptoms of Bhava Bhakti, the 9 symptoms. And what is pretend bhava? And what is the shadow of bhava? What is something that's almost bhava? And then chapter 19 is about prema. So this ends this first ocean, the 16th ocean. And it's a very brief chapter. And here Prabhupada also discusses the Shraddha to prema. Okay, going on to the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean now discusses the different components of rasa. So we've talked about rasa in a general way so far, that rasa is this taste, this pleasure, this mellow, this relationship. But well, what is it made out of? And we can think of it like, if you make a blended drink, like a smoothie, so maybe it has banana in it and yogurt, and maybe it has honey, maybe it has some saffron in it. It has different stuff that's in it that's blended up. And when you're tasting it, it's one taste, but you can also kind of taste, well, there's the yogurt and there's the honey, or something like a pizza. So, we have a pizza and it has the crust and has the tomato sauce and has the cheese, and then maybe it has eggplant or peppers or something like that on it. So it has different ingredients, and when you taste it, it's one taste, and yet it has these different components. So here, the Southern Ocean, Rupa Goswami goes into depth on these different components: the vibhava, the anubhava, the sattvika bhava, the vyavichari bhava, and the sthai bhava. And Srila Prabhupada translates these as ecstatic excitance, ecstatic expressions, or subsequent ecstasy, existential ecstasy, aggressive ecstasy, and continuous ecstasy. If we could suggest a simplified translation, vibhava is what stimulates rasa. Now, under vibhava, there's subcategories. So under vibhava, there's what's called alambana and udipana. So alambana is what Srila Prabhupada calls basic, and udipana is what he calls impelling. So the basic, or alambana, is the object of your relationship, which is in almost all cases Krishna. And then the shelter, or the ashraya of your relationship, which are devotees who have a similar type of love to your own. And udipana is anything having to do with Krishna, Krishna's flute, Krishna's peacock feather, Krishna's qualities, Krishna's pastimes, so forth. Anubhava are the voluntary expressions that you do. So, because you love Krishna, therefore you make a garland for him. Because you love Krishna, therefore you sing his glories. Sattvika bhavas are the involuntary expressions. That's like hair standing on end and tears coming from the eyes. Then there's the vyabhichari bhavas. These are transitory emotions. So when you have love for Krishna, you're sometimes going to feel joy, and sometimes you're going to feel laughter, and sometimes you're going to feel grief. Sometimes you're going to feel confusion. I mean, anything we can feel in this world has its counterpart there in the vyabhichari bhavas. And the sthai bhav is your basic connection. Krishna is my friend, or Krishna is my child, like that. And Prabhupada says, without some mixture of these 5 ecstatic principles, one cannot relish transcendental bliss. In other words, for there to be rasa, you have to have all 5 of these. So a very simple way to explain rasa, there's a basic connection to the flavor of the thing. That connection, that's the staibhav. That connection is stimulated somehow. That's the vibhav. A tangible result and expression, that's the anubhav. Automatic or involuntary, that's the sattvic bhav, and emotional result are the vyavichari bhavs. So to explain this further, the staibhav, what type of affection you have towards Krishna. Stimulants, things related to that affection. Again, the object, which is Krishna in most cases, the shelter, which is those who have similar relationships, and then the various things that stimulate it. Then voluntary expression, anubhava, ways of expressing this stimulated affection. Sattvika bhavs are involuntary ways we express this stimulated affection and various emotions, like the non-physical expression, what's going on internally. And one of the ways that Rupa Goswami explains this, now this sattva in the center is not sattva gun. It's not at all related to the gunas, this particular understanding of sattva. It's a state that exists in the heart. So you have the basic connection, the rati, or what's also called the staibhav. Again, this is like Krishna is my son, Krishna is my master, like that. Then that's added to these various transitory emotions. Rupa Goswami gives 33 of them. This produces a state of sattva in the heart. Again, this is not sattva guna, which leads to voluntary and involuntary expressions. Another way that one could see this, according to Rupa Goswami's description, is we have a dominant primary staibhav. Again, Krishna is my beloved, or Krishna is my son, Krishna is my master. You have the transient emotions, the vyavichari bhavs. Then you have the secondary staibhavs, things such as laughter, wonder, fear, chivalry, etc. This is all stimulated by the vibhav and gives rise to the anubhavs, the voluntary expressions, and the sattvika bhavs, or the involuntary expressions. All right, going on to a quick overview of the Western Ocean. Here, Rupa Goswami describes the 5 varieties of rasa, the 5 primary relationships. And each of these is a different wave in this Western Ocean. So there's 5 waves in the Western Ocean. And for each of these 5s, he describes all these categories of rasa. So for neutrality, he describes what's the vibhava, what's the anubhava, what's the sattvika bhava, what's the vyavichari bhava, what's the staibhava. Then he also describes meeting and separation, and he also describes degrees of love. So for each of these 5, remember I was talking about how Rupa Goswami is so systematic. All right, so that's basically what's in the Western Ocean. Then in the Northern Ocean, so here we have the 7 kinds of indirect ecstasies: laughing, astonishment, chivalry, compassion, anger, dread, and ghastliness. And he does the same thing with those. So for each of those, for laughing, he describes what is the vibhava, what is the anubhava, what is the sattvika bhava, etc. He describes the 5 components of rasa for each of these indirect ecstasies or secondary staibhavas. Then Rupa Goswami has, so those are each waves. So there's a wave for each of those secondary ones. And then something which is really, I find really interesting, is where Rupa Goswami goes into quite a bit of detail about compatibility. Which of these 7 secondary rasas and the 5 primary rasas are compatible or incompatible with each other, or neutral. So compatible, incompatible, or neutral. And he makes the point that if a person has a particular rasa and does something that's incompatible, then their feeling of rasa becomes a ras abas. Abas means a shadow or reflection, a semblance. So the taste kind of just becomes a semblance, because if you can think in a meal, if you stuck bitter melon into ice cream, it's incompatible and your enjoyment would become a shadow. Does that, if we can follow that, I can enjoy the ice cream, I can enjoy the bitter melon. If I eat them together, I get a shadow of pleasure instead of pleasure. So, and this idea is extremely important. Srila Prabhupada wrote in a letter to my god sister Yamuna, he said, if two people are compatible, then they make good advancement. And if there's 200 people associating and they're incompatible, nobody makes any advancement. So this aspect of the Nectar Devotion, Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu, that we need to choose what's compatible for us, and that's not going to be the same for everyone. And then Rupa Goswami also describes what looks like rasa and is not. And he touches on this previously, like with Bhava Bhas, with Sattvika Abhas, with, but now he's getting into it in general. So these are the 7 secondary rasas: laughter, astonishment, chivalry. Chivalry has 4 subcategories: compassion, anger, fear, and disgust. And again, each of these are discussed with their component parts, and then what's compatible, what's incompatible, and perversion. So this is a very quick run through of the Nectar of Devotion. And the Nectar of Devotion, and of course the book on which it is based, the Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu, are well worth the reading and rereading again of all the devotees. And we heartily recommend this book, which should increase one's faith, increase one's enthusiasm, and really give one direction in their spiritual life. Our indebtedness to Srila Prabhupada for producing this book cannot even be expressed. It's such a wealth that's really not available in practically any religious tradition in the world. I mean, we have all respect for all the bona fide traditions of the world. At the same time, I think we can unabashedly say that we are very happy to be Gaudiya Vaishnavas and to have the direction from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and to be Rupanugas, to have this direction from Rupa Goswami, and to have this gem given to us, practically speaking, in the very beginning of the movement by Srila Prabhupada. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity today to speak just a little bit about the Nectar Devotion. And maybe I'll go pick it up and read it right now. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama.